everybody, and welcome to another ASMR video here on the channel. In tonight's video, as you can tell, we're back with another history video. So I will shortly be replaced by a series of moving images, but tonight we're taking a little look at the history of Vikings. I've got one article from Life of Norway which gives a pretty good overview of the Vikings, and then we're going to take a look at another article which talks about Valhalla and how that belief in an afterlife caused the Vikings to be some of the most ferocious fighters, raiders, etc. In history. So, hopefully you enjoy this video, hopefully you find it informative as well as entertaining. And without further ado, let's get into it. Over the course of 250 years approximately, seafaring Norsemen left their homes to pursue riches abroad. The era has become almost legendary and left a lasting legacy on the world. But how much did you know about the long history of the Vikings? When it comes to the history of Norway and Scandinavia, few times are more iconic than the Viking Age. The fascination with this time in history continues apace, and its cultural legacy lives on. So, who were the Viking people? The Vikings came from what is now known as Scandinavia, Denmark, Norway and Sweden. However, they were not one race as such, rather small groups from all over the region. Also, Vikings weren't just limited to Scandinavia. Historical records indicate Finnish, Estonian and Sami Vikings as well. Aside from occasional trade, they had very little to do with one another, and in fact often fought amongst themselves. That being said, the Viking were united as a group in one circumstance: the eyes of the conquered. They came from foreign lands, were seen as uncivilized, and were not Christians. That would come later, of course. Viking history tends to focus on the warriors, typically men. Much has been written lately about the role of women in the Viking Age. Relatively few Norsemen actually set sail on raids and trade missions in the early years, at least until settlements were founded elsewhere. Instead, many worked out their lives as farmers or fishermen. So, taking a look at the Viking settlements in Norway and Scandinavia. Throughout Scandinavia, settlements were typically small farming communities, home to just one or a handful of families. Power was far from centralized, relying instead on a local chieftain and the alliances he would make along the coastline. Lofor Viking Museum on Norway's Lofoten Islands has a lot of great information about the role of a chieftain. The museum goes on to say that the chieftain would have to be generous with his wealth in order to gain support. We can assume that society was organized in a kind of redistribution system. This would involve the chieftain collecting taxes from the people in exchange for protection, the development of infrastructure, and the organization of other common business. In this way, the chieftain developed his power, alliances, and wealth. Viking families lived in long houses, a building split into sections with a fire at its heart. The benches surrounding the fire would serve dual purpose as daytime seating and nighttime beds. Typically, the building would be shared with livestock and used to store all manner of goods. best known settlements in Norway include Borg, home to the Lofotr Museum, and Alvedsnes, the latter near Haugesund, apologies for any pronunciation errors, was on a strategically important shipping route. The Alvedsnes Viking village is well worth a visit. Meanwhile, Denmark's Ribe is the oldest extant town in all of Scandinavia. Founded in the first decade of the 8th century, Ribe flourished as a trading centre. So, the beginnings of the Viking Age. One of the most common questions is, why did the Viking Age begin? No one is entirely sure, but it was clearly a transition. In the 7th and 8th centuries, Europe was growing wealthier. Scandinavian furs were prized items, and it's believed this early trade taught the pre-Viking people about sailing technology and the politics and weak points of Europe. There is pre-Viking evidence of trade between parts of Scandinavia too. In fact, recent research shows that whetstones found in Ribe came from the Lade Peninsula in Trondheim. Some believe overpopulation caused the Vikings to begin their travels, but that seems unlikely because the early raids were for riches, not land. Norsemen always had an important relationship with the water for food and transport. The development of faster, more reliable ships seems to have played at least a part in triggering the expansion overseas. This is one of the factors that makes recent archaeological discoveries of ships so fascinating. He explained, on that topic, Knut Barsch from the Norwegian Institute for Cultural Research joined me on a recent episode of the Life in Norway show. He explained that a new digital model of the June ship revealed new learning about its likely function. It now seemed likely the vessel could have crossed the North Sea, powered by a sail large enough to make it the fastest Viking ship ever discovered. Next up is the Lindisfarne raid. For any student of history, the name Lindisfarne conjures up images of the Viking raid in 793. While it seems unlikely to be the very first, it was documented in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, personal letters, and the famous Doomsday Stone. As they're the first written sources referencing a raid, it's typically taken to be the beginning of the era. It was the first of many attacks on monasteries along the British coastline. The Norsemen quickly identified these buildings as sources of wealth with weak defences, making them very attractive targets. Despite the written sources, archaeological evidence for the raid has been thin. The exact location of the original wooden monastery isn't known. The visible ruins on Lindisfarne today are from a later priory. However, archaeologists recently discovered a board game piece preserved in a ditch. Experts believe it could be from a variant of the Viking board game Nefatafl, also known as the King's Table. Bearing similarities to chess, the strategic board game simulates a Viking raid. It's hard not to imagine the warriors playing the game during their days at sea. Archaeologists don't know if the piece was dropped by a Viking raider or owned by a local, but they can draw some conclusions based on its high quality and the dating of the ditch to around the time of the raid. Buoyed by this early success at Lindisfarne, Viking raids became more numerous. Just 2 years later, they struck undefended island monasteries in the Hebrides and Northern Ireland. 4 more years on, and continental Europe was it. The island monastery of St. Philibert on Noirmoutier, if that's how you say it, near the estuary of the Loire River, was targeted in 799. Despite this, it was the British Isles that remained target number 1 for Viking raids for many years. It wasn't for another 40 years or so that attacks in continental Europe became commonplace. They achieved this in part by taking advantage of internal conflicts in Francia. So much so, following the death of an emperor of Francia, one of his sons invited the support of a Viking fleet in a power struggle with his brothers. So, looking at an expansion into Britain. After a period of prosperity for the Vikings in West Francia, King Charles the Bald began increasing his defences. As towns, abbeys and rivers were fortified from around 862, the Vikings, principally from Denmark, turned their attention back to the British Isles. 3 Icelandic sagas tell of an army that invaded England in 866, led by the sons of Ragnar Lodbrok. They wanted to take revenge against King Aella of Northumbria, who is said to have captured and executed Ragnar. Thanks in part to the recent TV series, Ragnar Lodbrok is one of the most famous Viking figures. However, many historians considered the stories, and even his very existence, dubious. Some think Ragnar is actually an amalgamation of several people. As raids became more numerous, Vikings started to create settlements. They gained control of many Scottish islands, including Shetland, Orkney, and the Hebrides, along with parts of the mainland. Ireland saw the founding of trading towns including Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick. From these bases, the Norsemen launched attacks elsewhere in Ireland and across the Irish Sea to England. The attacks on England were so numerous that only Kingdom was able to resist. Aside from Wessex, much of England fell. In 871, King Alfred the Great of Wessex became the only king to record a decisive victory against a Danish Viking army in England. After this, the Danes settled north of Wessex in an area that became known as Danelaw. This period saw the establishment of many trading cities that still exist today. The best known, York, is now home to a comprehensive Viking museum. This dominance would last for around 50 years, until English armies began to take back control. The descendants of Alfred of Wessex led the charge, eventually killing the last Dane leader, Eric Bloodaxe, around the year 952. So expansion into Europe and beyond. While Danes were in power and then driven out of the British Isles, other Vikings remained active in Europe. Many towns suffered, including Nantes on the French coast and towns further inland. Vikings stormed the Arab-controlled Seville and Italy's Pisa as they spread ever further. In 911, the king in West Francia granted the Viking chief Rollo a substantial victory a substantial territory, for preventing other raiders accessing the Seine. The legacy of this treaty lives on today, with the region's modern name Normandy, which means land of the Northmen. Norwegian Vikings also began to colonize Iceland, and then moved on to Greenland. Icelandic sagas tell us that those early Greenland settlers, led by Leif Erikson, may have become the first Europeans to discover North America. They built a temporary settlement, Vinland, in what is now lawns or meadows in Newfoundland. Archaeological evidence found in the 1960s confirmed this. However, it remains the only confirmed Norse site in or near North America, aside from Greenland. The next section is Danish dominance as Christianity spreads. Christianity's introduction to Scandinavia was slow and steady, rather than an overnight occurrence. One of the key figures behind this change was the Danish king Harald Bluetooth, who reigned from 958 to 986, we believe. The exact circumstances surrounding his own conversion are unclear, but what is clear is his substantial public works within Denmark. During his reign, Harold oversaw the reconstruction of the Jelling runic stones and fortifying the fortress of Aros, now known as Aarhus. I can't pronounce that. He also built 5 ring forts in strategic locations. Most historians believe these projects were about consolidating economic and military control. After this, Bluetooth's eye was drawn across the seas once again, and so a second wave of Viking activity began. Raids bigger than ever before targeted the faltering England. Over the course of 20 years, Harold's son Sven Forkbeard had conquered the kingdom by 1013. His son Knut then ruled a Scandinavian empire including Denmark, Norway, England, and of course the North Sea. Back in Norway, King Haakon the Good attempted to spread Christianity after his upbringing in England. However, his efforts were met with resistance. The subsequent king, Harald Greycloak, made this mark by destroying pagan temples, but also had little success in introducing the new faith. Things began to change during the short reign of Olaf Tryggvason. His aggressive conversion strategy, more burning of pagan temples and killing of resistors, was more effective and succeeded in making the country Christian, at least in name. Following Tryggvason's death in 1000, Norway did revert back for a short time, but that didn't last long. King Olav Haraldsson came to power in 1015 and was a big proponent of the new faith. After his death, Olav Haraldsson became Saint Olav, an act that sealed the dominance of Christianity in Norway. And that brings us into the end of the Viking Age. The end of the Viking Age was one of a slow decline rather than a sudden stop. At Borg in Lofoten, the chieftain's house was abandoned during a time of upheaval in the 1900s. As Norway became one nation and Christianity spread, power structures changed. Several great chieftains relocated in Iceland during this time. The North American settlement was abandoned in the early 11th century. This was most likely due to the long distance required for trade with Scandinavia. In 1030, Norway Viking-based Christian king Olaf Haraldsson was defeated in the Battle of Stiklestad. A real-life Game of Thrones took place involving a failed invasion from Norway's Harald Hardrad. Eventually, William, Duke of Normandy, took England's throne. He managed to retain the crown in spite of further Danish challenges. The slight irony here is that William was a descendant of the Scandinavian settlers in northern France. Of course, these stories have left a significant legacy not just in Scandinavia, but all over the world. There's TV shows and Viking movies, sports teams and other clubs and associations all with Viking names. The Danish city of Aarhus even uses little Viking characters on its pedestrian crossing lights. In fact, it could be argued that interest in the time of the travelling Norsemen has never been higher. Some of the tourism to Norway and Denmark is courtesy of the shared history. You can visit Viking farms, burial mounds, a ship museum, and even the remains of the ring forts. So that was a very, very brief overview of the history of the Vikings and the Viking Age. We're now going to take a look at another article which is titled Valhalla: How Viking Belief in a Glorious Afterlife Empowered Warriors. So, Old Norse literature about Vikings is filled with famous last stands, audacious last words, death songs, and defiance. When men died in battle, it was believed that the war god Odin gathered chosen slain warriors at his home in Asgard, the dwelling place of the gods in Norse mythology. Odin's mythical hall, called Valhalla, was a warrior's paradise built of spear shafts and roofed with shields. The Vikings' glorious attitude toward death was key to their success on the battlefields of Europe. This fatalistic Viking mindset was a kind of death cult, a psychological edge that allowed them to fight fearlessly. According to Viking mythology, when a warrior fell on the battlefield, he was greeted by a Valkyrie, a supernatural female figure. Valkyries protected some warriors, but guided spear points and arrows into the bodies of others. In the Viking mind, battles were determined not by military prowess, but through the agency of these faithful women. Mythical Valkyries led slain heroes from the battlefield to Odin's magnificent hall. Built of weapons and armour, Valhalla was the promised land of a Viking warrior. The Poetic Edda, a collection of myths and heroic stories written in 13th century Iceland, depicts Valhalla's dramatic construction. Spear shafts the building has for rafters. It's roofed with shields. Male goats are strewn across on the benches. A wolf hung above Valhalla's western door, according to writings, and an eagle hovered over the wolf. In her translation of the Poetic Edda, medieval scholar Carolyn Larrington notes that these creatures are Germanic beasts of battle. Their appearance signals that a fight is impending. The impending fight was the cataclysmic battle at Ragnarok, a mythological event the Vikings believed one day would occur. Ragnarok is like Armageddon, the battle at the end of the world. In it, the gods and their human allies will march out to fight against the frost giants and the fire giants, the trolls and the monsters. At Ragnarok, Odin side is Einar Jar, who would advance through Valhalla's 540 doors. 800 Einar Jar would exit out of reach, prepared to defend Asgard against the encroaching forces of chaos. Odin knows that Ragnarok is going to happen. In Valhalla, his Einar Jar train for the event by engaging daily battles. As detailed in the Edda, those slain in these battles were soon resurrected. For a Viking warrior, the battles of Valhalla allowed him to continue his earthly career into the afterlife, preparing for the fateful day when he would fight alongside the war god Odin. Jackson Crawford, an Old Norse specialist at the University of Colorado Boulder, describes Ragnarok as being the predetermined death of the gods. To the Vikings, fate was unchangeable and an integral facet of the Norse worldview. Ragnarok is the gods' equivalent of the scheduled death day that each mortal has, Crawford says. If you can only get to the good afterlife by dying in battle, and you're going to die on a particular day no matter what you do on that day, you're going to take any good opportunity to fight. This next section is titled Eric Bloodaxe, Harkon the Good. Not all Viking warriors were granted entrance to the mythical Valhalla, but ancient Norse poems describe heroes who were believed to be bestowed with the honour. Eirik Schmal, a poem written around 954, honours the 10th century Norwegian ruler Eric Bloodaxe. The poem describes the king's warlike existence, assaulting the coastlines of Europe, and Odin's preparation for his arrival in the afterlife. The poem's verses declare, "What kind of dream is this, that I had thought before daybreak I was preparing Valhalla for a slain army? I awakened the Einar Jar, asking them to get up to strew the benches and to rinse the drinking cups. I asked the Valkyries to bring wine, as if a leader should come." Viking sagas about Harkon the Good, king of Norway from 934 to 961, describe preparations for his entry to Valhalla. In the 990 poem Harkon Narmal, the Norse gods Hermod and Bragi ask Odin to welcome Harkon into Valhalla. Hermod and Bragi said to Odin, "Go to meet the monarch because a king is coming here to the hall who is deemed a champion," the poem reads. While poems describe Bloodaxe's and Harkon's many victories on Earth, it was believed their greatest battles would be staged in the afterlife at Ragnarok. And that brings us into a great Viking death. Among Valhalla's most legendary warriors was Ragnar Lothbrok, a 9th century Danish Viking hero whose exploits fill pages of Norse chronicles. While historians can't be sure whether Ragnar existed as an actual man or men, or was crafted from decades of mythology, Ragnar was celebrated for his bravado, even in the face of agonizing death. In the 12th century poem The Death Song of Ragnar Lothbrok, readers learn of this Viking's heroic fate. Ragnar intended to sail for England and swore that he would conquer it with a fleet of just 2 ships. After a few victories across the island, he was captured by the Northumbrian king Aila. I can't say that name. The king had Ragnar thrown into a snake pit, hoping he would suffer a slow and painful death. In this moment of what appeared to be an inevitable defeat, Ragnar composes a death song about how Valhalla is awaiting his arrival. His final verse ends with the declaration, "Laughing shall I die." As Crawford notes, passages like these show how mythology ascribed a fearless survivalist mindset to Viking warriors. The choice isn't between living and dying, he says. It's between dying badly and dying well on the day that you're going to die anyway. And that, my friends, is a rather brief history of the Vikings. I really hope you did enjoy. Apologies if you can hear an owl in the background. It's quite late, and there's an owl that lives in the trees next to my house, and around this time he starts going pretty crazy. So apologies if you can hear that. Don't be unsettled. But yeah, as always, any requests for history videos, be sure to leave them in the comment section down below. This was a requested video, one I was more than happy to do because it is a very interesting part of history. I would have done a super long video on it, but I'm kind of pressed for time a little bit because I'm going away in a few weeks and I need to get everything content-wise in order. So, anyways, I really hope you did enjoy this video. If you did and you're able to, please do give it a like and subscribe if you're new.